An elderly woman enters a luxury jewelry store and is treated with suspicion. Without evidence, the manager accuses her of theft in front of everyone, but a man walks in and reveals who she truly is. The mother of the chain's new owner had just been humiliated, and the entire country saw it. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. Thursday morning arrived in New York City with that typical grey sky that announces rain. In the heart of the Upper East Side, nestled between mirrored skyscrapers and glittering storefronts, Splendor Jewelry stood out as a temple of luxury. Its reinforced glass doors reflected the busy avenue where imported cars glided through the slow Manhattan traffic. The facade boasted the brand's name in gold letters, and the external windows displayed pieces that cost more than many Americans would earn in a lifetime. Inside the establishment, the air conditioning maintained a perfect temperature, and a discreet French perfume hung in the air like an invisible cloud of privilege. The Italian marble floor reflected the strategically positioned lights. The walls were lined with neutral-toned, textured wallpaper, and expensive. Abstract paintings decorated the spaces between the displays. Everything there had been thought out, calculated, and executed to convey a clear message of exclusivity, power, and distinction. Splendor Jewelry was not just a place to buy jewelry. It was a status symbol, a silent social filter that separated those who belonged from those who were just passing by. Mrs. Margaret Miller got off the bus 2 blocks before her usual stop. At 72, she maintained an upright posture that betrayed decades of teaching in classrooms, correcting students' posture, writing on chalkboards, and carrying stacks of exams to grade at home. Her hands, marked by time and labor, firmly held a synthetic leather handbag that had accompanied her steps for over 10 years. It was a simple bag, the kind found at local flea markets, with the leather already faded on the handles and small scratches on the side that told stories of daily use. Her discreet floral dress, bought at a small shop in a modest Brooklyn neighborhood during a Saturday afternoon, was clean and well pressed, but it was impossible not to notice the natural wear of the fabric at the seams and the slightly faded color that revealed countless washes. Her low, comfortable, and practical shoes completed the image of a simple woman, one whom life had taught to value the essential and to distrust the superfluous. She walked along the sidewalk, observing the windows with respectful curiosity. It wasn't common for her to frequent that part of the city. The distance between her world and this neighborhood wasn't measured just in miles, but in social chasms that few dared to cross. Her routine was divided between the modest apartment in Flatbush, where she had lived for decades, visits to former students who were now successful judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, and weekly meetings at the local community center, where she still helped with adult literacy groups. But that morning, something had brought her there. Something she wouldn't reveal just yet, a purpose kept deep in her chest, like a precious secret. She stopped in front of Splendor Jewelry, observed her reflection in the mirrored glass of the facade, and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with courage. There was no nervousness in her brown eyes, only a serenity that came from someone who had lived long enough not to be shaken by deceptive appearances or hasty judgments. The door opened automatically as she approached. The sensor identified her presence, but not her importance. Mrs. Margaret entered with calm steps, her gaze roaming over the illuminated displays where diamond necklaces, emerald rings, and white gold bracelets rested on velvet cushions. There were few customers at that hour. An elegant woman, wearing Chanel sunglasses and carrying a Hermès bag, was examining a set of earrings accompanied by a saleswoman with an impeccable smile. A man in a pinstripe suit was talking on his cell phone while waiting to be assisted. And then there was Lauren. Lauren Sterling had managed that branch of Splendor for 3 years. She had risen through the ranks quickly, not exactly because of technical competence or skill with customers, but because she knew how to flatter the right people at the right times and disdain those she considered irrelevant to her upward trajectory. At 38, she wore a black tailored suit that cost 2 months of a retired teacher's pension, and her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in an impeccable bun that had taken 40 minutes to construct that morning. Perfect makeup applied by professional hands, nails done weekly at a luxury salon on Madison Avenue, and imported perfume that cost more than the rent of many families. Lauren was the personification of what the jewelry store wanted to project to the world, at least on the polished surface she presented. Inside, she harbored a collection of prejudices inherited from an elitist upbringing, prejudices that were rarely confronted in that protected environment where she worked. She had learned early on to judge people by the clothes they wore, the cars they drove, and the neighborhoods they lived in. And never in all those years had she been seriously questioned for it. As Mrs. Margaret passed her toward one of the displays in the back, Lauren followed her with her eyes. It wasn't a look of welcome, it was a look of suspicion, the kind that searches and judges before a single word is even exchanged. The manager discreetly nudged the saleswoman, Sarah, a young woman in her early 20s who still believed in humanized service. "Sarah, understand one thing," Lauren whispered in a low but firm tone. "We can't let just anyone wander around in here unsupervised. You already know our client profile. If you see someone out of place, keep an eye out." "But she hasn't done anything," Sarah replied, uncomfortable. "Not yet," Lauren retorted, adjusting the pearl necklace she wore. "But prevention is always better than a loss. Stay sharp." Mrs. Margaret, oblivious to the conversation, stopped before a specific display. There, on a rotating stand, lay a sapphire necklace surrounded by small diamonds. The piece was delicate yet imposing. She tilted her head slightly, observing the light's reflections on the stones. She didn't touch the glass. She didn't call for anyone. She just observed like someone appreciating a work of art in a museum. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, approaching kindly. Mrs. Margaret turned and smiled. "I'm just looking, dear, thank you." The saleswoman nodded and stepped back, but Lauren remained close, pretending to organize papers on the main counter while keeping the elderly woman in her line of sight. Minutes passed. Mrs. Margaret continued observing different pieces, always with the same serene posture. At no point did she show any intention of touching anything or asking to see a jewel up close. She just looked. It was then that the security guard, Marcus, a man in his late 40s with a large build, approached Lauren. He had worked there for 6 months and already knew the manager's behavioral patterns. He knew she often asked him to watch certain customers more closely. Always the same profiles, always the same unfounded suspicions. "Do you want me to move closer?" he asked in a low voice. "Keep an eye out," Lauren replied, without taking her eyes off Mrs. Margaret. "You never know." Marcus nodded, but something in him hesitated. He had already witnessed embarrassing situations in there. People humiliated by pure assumption. Legitimate customers treated as suspects just because they weren't wearing designer clothes. And every time, he had remained silent, obeying orders, avoiding conflict. After all, he needed the job. He had bills to pay, a young daughter to support. But the discomfort always remained. Mrs. Margaret, after long minutes of observation, walked toward the central counter. Lauren immediately straightened her posture, like a predator identifying the moment to strike. The elderly woman stopped in front of her, and with a calm voice, asked if she could see the sapphire necklace more closely. "That necklace?" Lauren questioned, with a tone that already carried suspicion. "Yes," Mrs. Margaret replied calmly. "I would like to see it better." Lauren crossed her arms. "Are you interested in buying?" It wasn't a question. It was a disguised accusation. "I'm interested in seeing," Mrs. Margaret replied, unfazed. "It's just that this type of piece is very valuable, you know. We need to be careful with who handles it." The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on Lauren, without blinking, without looking away. There was no anger in her eyes. There was sadness, that deep sadness of someone who recognizes an old pattern, a social wound that never completely heals. "I understand," the elderly woman said, her voice still firm. "Then I will just continue. Looking if it's no trouble." Lauren didn't answer. She turned and went back behind the counter but continued monitoring every move. Other customers began to notice the tension in the air. The elegant woman in Chanel sunglasses cast a side glance. The man in the suit stopped talking on the phone for a moment. Even Sarah, on the other side of the store, felt the atmosphere shift. Mrs. Margaret went back to observing the displays. She walked slowly, with the dignity of someone who knows they owe nothing to anyone. She stopped before another piece, a rose gold bracelet with pearl details. She leaned in slightly to observe it better but kept her hands at her sides. It was then that Lauren felt it was time to act. She stepped out from behind the counter with determined strides, crossed the floor, and stopped a few feet from Mrs. Margaret. Her face was tight, her nostrils flared. She took a deep breath like someone preparing for an inevitable confrontation. And then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she fired the accusation that would change everything. "You're going to have to come with me now." Mrs. Margaret turned slowly. "Excuse me?" "I saw what you did. You put something in your bag. I saw it." The impact was immediate and devastating. Conversation ceased as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. Heads turned in sync, moved by the morbid curiosity that draws crowds to accidents. The woman in the Chanel glasses widened her eyes and took a step back, as if the mere fact of being close could somehow contaminate her. The man in the suit hung up his phone with a sharp motion and positioned himself to get a better view of the scene. Sarah dropped the pen she was holding, and the sound of the object hitting the marble floor echoed through the tense silence. Marcus, the security guard, took a step forward but stopped halfway, undecided between following protocol and following his conscience. And Mrs. Margaret remained motionless, statuesque, with her hands visible one on each side of her body, her fingers slightly open in a clear demonstration that she was hiding nothing. "I think there has been a mistake," she said, her voice still controlled. But there was a deep sadness in those words, the sadness of someone who already knew this kind of humiliation and hoped never to have to face it again. "There was no mistake at all," Lauren shot back, now speaking even louder. "I've worked here for years. I know how to recognize when someone tries to take something that isn't theirs. Show me the bag." Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath. Her shoulders rose and fell in a slow, almost rhythmic motion. She looked around, saw cell phones being discreetly raised, saw the judgmental stares, saw the public humiliation being built brick by brick, and even so she remained calm. "I didn't take anything," she said firmly. "Then you won't mind." "Showing the bag," Lauren insisted, taking another step forward. "I have nothing to hide," Mrs. Margaret replied, "but I would like to understand why I am being accused without any proof." "The proof is me," Lauren shouted, finally losing her composure. "I saw it. And people like you always try to take advantage of places like this. You think you can come in here, pretend to be interested, and leave with something hidden. But it doesn't work with me." The prejudice was now explicit. There was no more disguise, no more subtlety. Discrimination poured from Lauren's mouth like venom accumulated. For years. Mrs. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was an even deeper sadness in them. "People like me," she repeated, almost in a whisper. "And what am I like, in your opinion?" Lauren hesitated. She realized she might have gone too far, but pride and arrogance wouldn't allow her to back down. "Look around, ma'am. Look at our customers, and then look at yourself. Do you think it's not obvious?" A deathly silence took over the jewelry store. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Sarah put her hand to her mouth, horrified. Marcus lowered his head, ashamed to be part of this. And the customers present, involuntary witnesses to an injustice in the 21st century, remained paralyzed. Mrs. Margaret slowly opened her worn bag. She took out a handkerchief, a small wallet, a glasses case, and her house keys. She placed everything on the counter with calm, deliberate movements. There was no rush, there was no desperation, only the unshakable dignity of someone who had already survived much worse storms. "You can search it," she said. "Do what you feel is necessary." Lauren grabbed the bag and rummaged through every compartment. Her fingers searched inner pockets, side zippers, and linings. Nothing. Absolutely nothing besides the personal belongings already on the counter. The expression of certainty on her face began to falter, but instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing her error, she insisted, "Maybe you hid it somewhere else. Marcus, call the police." The guard hesitated. "Lauren, I think—" "Call them now," she ordered, regaining authority in her voice. Marcus pulled the radio from his belt and made the call. Meanwhile, outside the jewelry store, one of the customers witnessing the scene had already posted a video on social media. The title was too direct to be ignored. The humiliation was being broadcast in real time to thousands of people. Shares were multiplying. Indignant comments grew every second. But inside Splendor, no one yet knew about the bomb that was about to explode. Mrs. Margaret remained standing serene, with her hands now folded in front of her. She looked at Lauren with an expression that mixed sadness and compassion. Then she looked at Marcus, who avoided her gaze, and finally she swept her eyes across the room, meeting the faces of those watching the injustice in silence. "It's all right," she said in a low voice. "Call whoever you need. The truth always comes out, sooner or later." Those words, spoken with such conviction, should have served as a warning, but Lauren, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, couldn't see it. She just crossed her arms, satisfied with herself, waiting for the arrival of the police like someone expecting a guaranteed victory. And as the minutes passed, a silent transformation began to happen. Out there on social media, the image of Splendor Jewelry was crumbling. Inside, a simple-looking elderly woman remained standing, alone against everyone, protected only by the invisible force of dignity. And somewhere in the city, a man watched everything on a screen, with clenched fists and a broken heart. The storm was just beginning. The minutes that followed seemed to drag on like hours. Mrs. Margaret remained standing, serene, while Lauren paced back and forth with her phone in hand, pretending to check messages, but actually just trying to hide the growing nervousness that was beginning to crack her facade of authority. The truth was that something in this situation wasn't going as planned. The elderly woman wasn't panicking, wasn't pleading, wasn't crying. She was just waiting. And that disconcerting calm was starting to bother Lauren. Sarah, the young saleswoman, discreetly approached Marcus. "Do you really think she took something?" she whispered, looking sideways at Mrs. Margaret. The guard shook his head slightly. "I didn't see anything, Sarah. I was watching the whole time. She didn't even touch the displays." "Then why is Lauren doing this?" Marcus sighed deeply, the weight of silent complicity crushing his chest. "You know Lauren. She always does this to anyone who doesn't fit her standards." "But this is wrong, Marcus." "Very wrong." "I know, but who's going to confront the manager? You? Me? We need the job, Sarah." The girl bit her lower lip, feeling helplessness burn in her throat like bile. She knew Marcus was right. She had witnessed other similar situations. People humiliated, embarrassed, kicked out of the store for no real reason other than not wearing the right clothes or not driving the right car. And every time, she too had remained silent, protecting the salary that barely covered her expenses. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the elderly woman's silent dignity. Maybe it was Lauren's explicit cruelty. Or maybe it was just the accumulation of injustices that, when it reaches a certain point, can no longer be ignored. Outside the jewelry store, the social media activity had already turned into a digital tornado. The video posted by the customer in the sunglasses, who had filmed the first moments of the accusation, already surpassed 50,000 views in less than 15 minutes. Shares were multiplying exponentially. Influencer profiles began reposting with indignant comments. Hashtags like Machine Splendor Prejudice and Justice for Mrs. Miller began to climb the US trending topics. Comments accumulated by the thousands. "This is unacceptable. What a disgrace for this jewelry store. My grandmother went through this once. To this day, she hasn't forgotten the humiliation. Disgusting prejudice. I hope this manager loses her job. Does anyone know who the old lady is? Let's help her." America needs to end this kind of discrimination. In Splendor's corporate offices on Park Avenue, the phones began ringing non-stop. PR assistants ran from room to room trying to understand what was happening. The communications director, Victoria Vance, opened her laptop and felt her stomach churn as she saw the numbers. 500,000 views, 1 million, 1.5 million. The speed was terrifying. "Someone explain to me right now what is happening at the Upper East Side branch," she shouted to her team. An intern, her face pale, held out her phone showing the video. "Miss Vance, you need to see this." Victoria watched the first 30 seconds and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. 22 years in her career, dozens of crises managed, scandals smoothed over, lawsuits avoided, images restored. But this was different. This was a social bomb in full explosion, and she knew the shrapnel was already flying in every direction. "Call the branch now and get me. The manager's cell phone. What's her name?" "Lauren Sterling." Victoria typed the name into her computer and accessed the personnel file. 3 years with the company, no formal complaints, good sales performance. But there were discreet notes about differential treatment of customers, nothing officially documented, everything between the lines. Meanwhile, back at the jewelry store, a police cruiser parked in front of the entrance. 2 officers stepped out, a man of about 40 named Charles and a younger woman named Fiona. They had received a call about a shoplifting in progress, routine, just one of dozens of daily occurrences. "Good afternoon," Officer Charles greeted as he entered the jewelry store. "We received a call about a theft." Lauren immediately stepped forward, taking control of the narrative before any other version could be presented. "Officer, thank you for coming so quickly. This woman," she pointed at Mrs. Margaret with a theatrical gesture, "was caught stealing a high-value jewel from this store. I saw clearly when she put something in her bag." Officer Fiona looked at Mrs. Margaret, who remained silent, and something in her expression made her hesitate. She had worked long enough on the streets of New York to develop an instinct about people, and that elderly woman did not have the behavior of someone who had just committed a crime. "Ma'am," Fiona called out with a professional but respectful voice, "could you tell us what happened?" Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice came out firm, without tremors, carrying decades of experience in making herself heard in noisy classrooms. "I entered this jewelry store as an ordinary customer. I observed some pieces in the windows. I didn't touch anything. I didn't take anything. And I was publicly accused, without any evidence, of having stolen a jewel that I don't even know what it would be." "She's lying," Lauren interrupted vehemently. "I saw it, I'm absolutely sure." Officer Charles crossed his arms. "Then let's clear this up simply. Ma'am," he addressed Mrs. Margaret, "would you mind showing us the contents of your bag?" "I don't mind," she replied, picking up the bag that was still on the counter. "I already did this once for the manager, but I will do it again for you." With calm and deliberate movements, Mrs. Margaret opened the bag and began to take out her belongings. A floral fabric handkerchief worn at the edges, a brown synthetic leather wallet with the clasp slightly loose, a navy blue glasses case, house keys on a simple keychain with a plastic angel, a pack of mints, a small notebook with a floral cover, and finally, a red velvet case, slightly dusty. The silence that followed was absolute. Lauren's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and validation passing over her face. The officers looked at each other. Sarah put her hand to her mouth. Marcus closed his eyes, anticipating the outcome that seemed inevitable. And Mrs. Margaret Serene placed the case on the marble counter. "That's it!" Lauren shouted, triumphant. "I told you she had taken it. See, I was right." Officer Fiona picked up the case carefully, opened the lid, and revealed the contents. Inside lay a delicate necklace, with stones that sparkled under the jewelry store's artificial light. It wasn't a modern piece. It had a vintage air, something that belonged to another era. The stones, though beautiful, were not diamonds. They appeared to be crystals, or perhaps citrines. The gold was discreet, worked with a craftsmanship not seen in contemporary jewelry. "Is this necklace from this store?" Charles asked. Lauren moved closer to examine it, better frowning. "I've never seen this piece before, but she tried to hide it. That in itself is proof of bad intent." Fiona turned to Mrs. Margaret. "Does this necklace belong to you?" "It does," the elderly woman replied with the same calm. "It belonged to my mother. She left it to me when she passed away 15 years ago. It is one of the few things of value I have. It was in my bag because I came straight from a doctor's appointment in the area and didn't want to leave it at home." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Lauren questioned, trying to keep the accusation afloat. Mrs. Margaret stared at her with eyes that mixed sadness and an almost supernatural patience. "Because you accused me of theft without giving me any chance to explain. You shouted, you humiliated, you judged. And at no point did you ask if there was another explanation." Officer Charles took the case and examined it more closely. He turned the necklace under the light, observed the details of the clasp, and analyzed its condition. "This piece isn't from here," he said, finally looking at Lauren. "It's clearly antique. And the style doesn't match anything I've seen in the displays." Lauren felt the floor begin to shift beneath her feet. But she was acting suspiciously. People like her always... "People like me," Mrs. Margaret interrupted, and for the first time her voice rose slightly in pitch, carrying decades of accumulated pain. "You've used that expression before. People like me. And exactly what does that mean, manager?" The silence that took over the jewelry store was oppressive. Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her mind desperately searched for a justification, an exit, something that could reverse the situation that was slipping more and more out of her control. But she found nothing, because deep down she knew exactly what she had done, and she knew there was no possible excuse. Officer Fiona tucked away her notebook. "There is no crime here. Ma'am," she addressed Mrs. Margaret, "you are free to go, and I am very sorry for the embarrassment." Mrs. Margaret nodded in silence, putting her belongings back in her bag with the same calm with which she had removed them. Her movements were slow, almost ritualistic, each object returning to its place: the handkerchief, the wallet, the glasses case, the keys, the notebook, and finally the red velvet case with her mother's necklace, that jewel that carried memories of simpler times, of hugs that would never return, of a woman who had taught her to maintain her dignity even when the world insisted on taking it from her. "I would like to file a complaint," Lauren said suddenly, trying one last desperate move. "This whole situation caused a disturbance to the store, frightened customers, interrupted business." Charles looked at her with an expression that mixed disbelief and disapproval. "Are you aware that falsely accusing someone of a crime is in itself a crime? Slander, defamation. And depending on the circumstances, it can constitute emotional distress." Lauren turned pale. I was just protecting the company's property." Fiona shook her head, genuinely disappointed. "You humiliated an elderly person publicly without any proof, based solely on prejudice. If anyone should be filing a complaint here, it would be the victim, not the accuser." Mrs. Margaret adjusted the bag on her shoulder and looked around. The customers who had witnessed everything were still there, paralyzed, silent witnesses to an injustice that had become too public to be ignored. Some had already lowered their phones, embarrassed by their own passive complicity. Others were still filming, documenting every second of that turnaround. "I won't sue," Mrs. Margaret said, looking directly at Lauren. "Not because you don't deserve consequences, but because I believe the public humiliation you just went through is lesson enough. I hope you learn something from this. I hope that next time you look at a person and judge them by their appearance, you remember this day and choose differently." With those words, Mrs. Margaret walked toward the door. Her footsteps echoed through the silence of the jewelry store, measured and dignified. Marcus, the security guard, who had remained silent throughout the scene, stepped forward and opened the door for her. Their eyes met for a brief instant, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between them. He knew he had failed. He knew his omission had made him an accomplice, and he knew he had to live with that. "I'm sorry," he whispered as she passed. Mrs. Margaret stopped, turned slightly, and placed her hand on his arm. A gentle, almost maternal touch. "You still have time to choose differently," she said softly. "It's never too late to do what is right." And then she left, crossing the glass door and emerging into the grey New York afternoon. The rain that the sky had promised since morning finally began to fall, thin and persistent. Mrs. Margaret opened a simple black umbrella and followed the sidewalk, disappearing among the hurried pedestrians seeking shelter from the drizzle. Inside the jewelry store, Lauren remained standing, her hands trembling slightly, her face still pale. The officers left after recording some notes. The customers, not quite knowing what to do, also began to leave discreetly. Sarah looked at the manager with a mixture of pity and contempt, and then returned to her post without saying a word. And Marcus returned to his position by the entrance, but something in him had changed. A decision was beginning to form in his mind. Outside those walls of glass and marble, the digital storm continued to grow. The video now had millions of views. Elderly rights protection groups had already identified the jewelry store and started boycott campaigns. Journalists were looking for information about the elderly woman. And somewhere in the city, in an office with a panoramic view of Park Avenue, a young man with dark eyes and a serious expression turned off the computer, where he had watched everything through the remote security cameras. Robert Miller was 36 years old, with black hair slightly graying at the temples, and a posture that mixed determination with something that looked like contained pain. He was the new majority owner of the Splendor chain, a position he had assumed only 3 weeks earlier after a strategic acquisition that surprised the luxury market. The son of a retired teacher and a father who had left too soon, Robert had built an empire from scratch, working in accounting offices during the day and studying law at night, turning every saved cent into an investment, every opportunity into growth. And now, watching the security camera footage where his mother, Mrs. Margaret, was publicly humiliated in the jewelry store he had just acquired, Robert felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination burning in his chest. He had asked her to do that test. He wanted to know how his employees treated ordinary people. He wanted to understand the real culture of the company he had just bought. But he never imagined the result would be so brutal, so explicit, so painful to watch. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. The call was answered on the second ring. "Convene an emergency meeting with the entire board, now. And I want the manager of the Upper East Side branch in my office in 1 hour. I accept no excuses." On the other end of the line, the secretary replied with a tense voice, "Yes, Mr. Miller, but are you aware that—" "I am aware of everything," Robert interrupted, "and that is exactly why I need to act. My mother was just humiliated in a company that carries my name, and this will not stand." He hung up the phone and looked out the window. The rain was now falling heavily over New York, washing the streets, but unable to wash away the stain that had just been exposed. Robert knew that what would come next would change everything. Not just for the company, but for everyone involved in that story, and mainly for a society that desperately needed to learn a lesson about respect, dignity, and humanity. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The meeting room on the 22nd floor of the commercial building on Park Avenue had a panoramic view of New York. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city pulsing below, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in that space of power. The glass table held 12 black leather chairs, and on it rested bottles of mineral water and notebooks that no one would touch. The LED lights embedded in the ceiling created an aseptic, almost surgical atmosphere. It was there that important decisions were made, contracts signed, and destinies defined. Robert Miller entered the room with firm steps, but his face carried an expression that mixed control and contained fury. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit, but had dispensed with the tie. His dark eyes scanned those present. Victoria Vance, the communications director, was already seated with her laptop open, her face marked by the tension of someone who had spent the last 2 hours trying to contain a fire with a glass of water. Beside her, Gregory Moore, the legal director, a man with glasses and a permanently worried expression. On the other side of the table, the HR director, Andrea Campbell, was nervously flipping through some printed documents. And in the farthest corner, visibly out of place, in that corporate environment, was Lauren Sterling. Her impeccable bun from the morning now showed loose strands. Her makeup was slightly smudged around her eyes, betraying tears she had tried to hide in the bathroom before coming up. Her hands trembled slightly on her lap, and she avoided looking directly at anyone in the room. Robert didn't sit down immediately. He remained standing, his hands resting on the back of the chair at the head of the table, and let the silence stretch for long seconds. It was a technique he had learned in difficult negotiations. Silence was more uncomfortable than words. It forced people to confront their own thoughts, their own guilt. Can someone explain to me, he finally began, his voice low but charged with an authority that didn't need volume, how a company I just acquired for $120 million is at this very moment becoming the national symbol of prejudice and discrimination. Victoria cleared her throat. Mr. Miller, the situation escalated very quickly. The video went viral in less than an hour. We've already surpassed 5 million views. We have boycott hashtags in first place on trending topics. Human rights groups have already issued statements of condemnation, and the press is looking for us non-stop. I know all that, Victoria. I watched it, from beginning to end, through the store's security cameras. I saw every second of that public humiliation, so I don't need reports. I need solutions. Gregory, the legal director, adjusted his glasses. From a legal standpoint, sir, we can argue it was an isolated error of judgment by one employee. We can distance ourselves from the individual action and reinforce that this doesn't represent the company's values. Robert looked at him with an expression bordering on contempt. An isolated error. Is that what we're going to call it? And when they find out it wasn't isolated, that there's a pattern, that this culture has existed in this company for years. The silence that followed was heavy. Andrea, the HR director, moved uncomfortably in her chair. With all due respect, Mr. Miller, we have never had formal complaints about discrimination. You never had formal complaints, Robert repeated, his voice heavy with bitter irony. Or you never created an environment where people felt safe to complain. Which of the two do you think is more likely, Andrea? The woman lowered her eyes, without an answer. Robert finally sat down, but his posture remained tense and upright. He opened a folder he had brought and spread some sheets on the table. They were screenshots of social media comments, news articles, and WhatsApp group discussions about the case. Have you seen this? He asked, pointing to the documents. It's not just people outraged by what happened today. It's former employees telling similar stories. It's customers reporting similar situations they witnessed. These are reports from years of a rotten culture that no one wanted to see. Lauren, who until then had remained silent, finally dared to speak. Her voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. Mr. Miller, I didn't know. I thought I was protecting the company's property. It was a misunderstanding. Robert turned to her with a speed that made her shrink in her chair. A misunderstanding? You accused a 72-year-old woman publicly of theft, without proof, without verification, based solely on how she was dressed, and you call that a misunderstanding? I saw something suspicious. It's my job to stay alert. Lauren, Robert said, and there was something in his voice now that sounded painfully personal. That woman you humiliated today is my mother. The impact was like a silent explosion. Victoria dropped the pen she was holding. Gregory widened his eyes. Andrea put her hand to her mouth, and Lauren turned completely pale, the blood draining from her face as if someone had opened a faucet. Your mother? She managed to stammer. My mother, Robert confirmed, and for the first time his voice trembled slightly, revealing the pain beneath his control. Margaret Miller, a retired teacher, the woman who worked 40 years in public schools in the inner city, who educated hundreds of young people who are now judges, prosecutors, lawyers, doctors, the woman who raised a son alone after my father passed away too soon, who sold home-baked goods door to door to pay for my college books, who has never, in her entire life, taken anything that wasn't hers. That is the woman you called a thief. Tears were now running freely down Lauren's face. I didn't know. How could I have known? And that is exactly the problem, Robert replied, his voice regaining its firmness. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You simply looked at an elderly person in simple clothes and decided she didn't deserve to be there. You decided she was a suspect. You decided she was guilty. All this before a single word was exchanged. Robert stood up again and walked to the window, observing the city below. When I took over this company, he said, his back to everyone, I made a request to my mother. I asked her to visit some of our stores without identifying herself. I wanted to know how we treated ordinary people, the customers who don't arrive in imported cars, who don't wear designer clothes. I wanted to understand the real culture of this company, not the one written in corporate manuals. He turned to face the room again. And now I know. Now I've seen with my own eyes the kind of treatment we offer, and it is unacceptable." Victoria tried to intervene. "Mr. Miller, I understand your outrage, but we need to think strategically. If we publicly admit it was your mother, the situation could become even more complex." "More complex?" Robert questioned. "Victoria, the situation cannot get more complex. It's already a complete disaster. The difference is that now we are going to handle it with transparency and honesty. No more hiding, no more minimizing, no more protecting a culture that is rotten." "And what do you propose, sir?" Gregory asked cautiously. Robert returned to the head of the table and sat down, but this time his posture was different. There was determination there, but also a vulnerability rare in corporate environments. "I propose the following. Lauren is fired for cause, effective immediately. I accept no appeals, no negotiations." Lauren sobbed loudly, but Robert continued without pause. "We are going to issue an official statement taking full responsibility for what occurred. We are not going to blame just one employee. We are going to recognize that a problematic culture exists in the company, and we are going to announce concrete measures." "What kind of measures?" Andrea asked. Robert picked up a piece of paper and began to list. "Mandatory training on diversity and inclusion for all employees without exception, creation of an anonymous channel for reporting discrimination, a complete review of all service protocols, hiring an external consultancy specialized in combating prejudice to audit our practices, and a public campaign of commitment to dignified service for all people, regardless of appearance or social condition." The silence that followed was one of astonishment. Gregory was the first to react. "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, this will cost millions, and it will expose the company even further." "I prefer to spend millions doing what is right than save money perpetuating what is wrong," Robert replied firmly. "And as for exposure, Gregory, we are already exposed. The difference is that now we are going to expose ourselves by doing something about it, instead of just trying to hush it up." Victoria took a deep breath. "If that's the direction, then we need to act fast. The window of opportunity to control the narrative is short. I suggest we make a video statement today. With you. Personally." "I agree," Robert said. "But I don't want a cold corporate video. I want to speak as a human being, as the son of the woman who was humiliated, as the new owner who is disgusted by what he saw. No script, no legalese, just the truth." Andrea raised a question. "And the other employees? The ones who witnessed it and did nothing? The guard? The saleswomen?" Robert pondered. "Summon everyone for individual sessions. I want to understand each person's role. Some may have been passive, accomplices for fear of losing their jobs. Others may have tried to do something and were ignored. We need to separate those who were complicit by choice from those who were silenced by coercion." Lauren, who was crying softly, finally managed to form a complete sentence. "I'm sorry, truly, I didn't realize. I was raised believing, I always thought I was just being professional." Robert looked at her for a long moment. There was anger there, but also something that could be mistaken for pity. "Lauren, you were raised in an environment that normalized prejudice, like millions of people. But being an adult means questioning what we were taught. It means choosing to be better. And you chose to perpetuate it." He paused. "You are fired, but I'm going to give you some advice. Use this pain, use this shame, and become a better person. Because if you continue being who you were today, your professional life is over before it begins. No one will want to hire the manager from the discrimination video." Lauren stood up, staggering, her legs barely supporting her. She left the room in silence, and the sound of the door closing echoed like a final period. Those who remained were silent for a few moments. Then Robert spoke again, his voice now softer but no less determined. "I want you to understand one thing. My mother doesn't want revenge. She never did. When she left that jewelry store, she wasn't angry. She was sad. Sad because she saw once again how much our society still needs to evolve." He looked at each person in the room. "But I am not as generous as she is. I am angry. And I'm going to use this anger to transform this company so that no other person ever again goes through what my mother went through, and if that means dismantling everything and rebuilding from scratch, Then that is what we are going to do. Victoria nodded, already typing on her laptop. I'll prepare the outline for the video. No outline, Victoria. Just give me a camera and a quiet place. I'm going to speak from the heart. Outside that room, New York continued its frantic routine. Millions of people in their own worlds, their own battles. But on that 22nd floor, a small revolution was being planned. Not with weapons or barricades, but with words, policies, and a commitment to do things differently. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Mrs. Margaret was preparing chamomile tea, her hands still firm despite her age. She knew her son was furious. She knew that fire that burned in him when he saw injustice. It was the same fire she had always tried to temper with wisdom and patience. The phone rang. It was Robert. "Mom," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I saw everything. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for asking you to do this. I never imagined it would be so—" "Son," she interrupted softly, "don't apologize. That was exactly why I agreed to do it. Because we needed to know, and now we know. And you are going to do the right thing. I trust you." "But you didn't deserve to go through that." Mrs. Margaret smiled, even knowing he couldn't see her. "My son, I've been through worse. And I survived. What happened today doesn't define me. It defines that young woman, and it defines the society we created. But it also defines what you're going to do now, and in that I am proud." Robert took a deep breath, on the other end of the line. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, my son. Now go. Do what needs to be done. And remember, this isn't about revenge. It's about transformation." When she hung up, Mrs. Margaret went back to her cup of tea. She looked out the window of her apartment, seeing the city lights begin to turn on in the approaching night. She thought of all the battles she had fought in her life, all the humiliations she had swallowed in silence, all the times she had been judged by her appearance and not her character. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, this time something would change, not just for her, but for all the other Margarets who still faced the daily prejudice of a society that insisted on judging by appearances. Outside, night fell over New York, and with it the promise of a different tomorrow. The improvised studio in the meeting room was simple. A professional camera mounted on a tripod, a neutral grey background, and two soft lights positioned strategically. Victoria had suggested hiring a full production crew, but Robert refused. He wanted something authentic, human, without the corporate gimmicks that usually distance businessmen from real people. He was sitting in a swivel chair without his jacket, just his light blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair was slightly disheveled, a sign he had run his hands through it multiple times in the last few hours. There was no professional makeup, no teleprompter, no script, just a man about to speak truths that many would prefer to keep hidden. "Ready?" the video technician asked. Robert took a deep breath, adjusted his posture and nodded. The red light on the camera turned on. "Good evening. My name is Robert Miller, and I am the new majority owner of Splendor Jewelry. Today, one of our branches was the scene of an incident that went viral on social media and exposed something that I, as the new manager of this company, cannot and will not tolerate. A customer was publicly accused of theft without any proof, based solely on her appearance. She was humiliated, embarrassed, and treated like a criminal simply for not fitting the aesthetic standard that some people associate with those who can frequent a luxury jewelry store." He paused, and his voice trembled slightly as he continued. "That customer was my mother, Mrs. Margaret Miller, a 72-year-old retired teacher who dedicated 40 years of her life to public education, a woman who raised a son alone, who worked tirelessly to give opportunities she herself never had, a woman who, contrary to what our store manager presumed, has more dignity and character in a single finger than many people manage to accumulate in a lifetime." Robert looked directly into the camera, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "But here is the most important point. Even if she weren't my mother, even if she were a complete stranger, that would be equally unacceptable. What happened today is not about who the victim was. It's about the kind of society we've built. A society where we judge people by what they wear before we know who they are. where we presume guilt based on appearance, where respect is treated as a privilege for some, not a right for all. He shifted in his chair. I take full and absolute responsibility for what happened. Yes, it was a specific employee who committed the act. But she didn't act in a vacuum. She acted within a culture that allowed, tolerated, and perhaps even encouraged that kind of behavior. And that culture stops today. The manager responsible has been fired for cause, but that is just the beginning. Because firing one person doesn't solve a systemic problem. Robert picked up a piece of paper that was on the table beside him. Starting now, Splendor will implement the following measures. First, mandatory training on diversity, inclusion, and anti-prejudice for 100% of our employees. It will not be optional. It will be a requirement for staying with the company. Second, the creation of an independent channel for reporting discrimination, managed by an external human rights organization. Third, a complete review of all service protocols with specialized consultancy. Fourth, a public campaign of commitment to dignified and respectful service to all people, regardless of social class, race, age, gender, or any other identity marker. He set the paper aside. I know many will say this is just marketing, that it's a response to public pressure. And you know what? You're right to be suspicious. Because we live in a country where companies frequently make empty promises after scandals. But I didn't buy this company to perpetuate what was wrong. I bought it to transform it, and I will be personally involved in every stage of this transformation. I will visit stores without notice. I will talk to employees. I will listen to customers, and I will hold accountable anyone at any hierarchical level who disrespects another human being. Robert looked down for a moment, gathering strength for the hardest part. My mother called me a little while ago. You know what she said? She said she doesn't want revenge. She said she doesn't want to sue. She said she only hopes something good comes out of this, that other people don't have to go through what she went through. That is the woman who was called a thief today, a woman who, even when humiliated, still thinks of the collective before herself. And if she can have that generosity, I can at least have the courage to do what is right. He swallowed hard. So this is my public commitment, to my mother, to everyone who has ever been judged unfairly, and to the country we want to build. Splendor will no longer be a company that discriminates. It will be a company that respects. And if that costs us customers who think respect should have a social class, then let us lose those customers, because some values are not negotiable. Robert remained silent for a few seconds, letting the words resonate. Thank you for watching. And thank you, Mom, for teaching me that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry inside. The red light went out. Robert let out the breath he seemed to have been holding for minutes. Victoria, who had watched from off-camera, had tears in her eyes. It was perfect, she said, her voice choked. It was honest, Robert corrected. Now let's see if people believe it. The video went live at 10 p.m. that Thursday. In less than 10 minutes, it already had 100,000 views. In half an hour, 500,000. In an hour, 2 million. The comments began to arrive in waves. Now that is a stance. Congratulations on the courage. Crying here. What a wonderful son. What an amazing mother. Finally, a businessman who takes real responsibility. Let's see if he fulfills what he promised. But the speech was strong. My grandmother deserved a grandson like that. Too emotional. But there was also skepticism, as Robert had predicted. Beautiful in theory. I want to see it in practice. Well done marketing, but will anything actually change? Easy to talk after it went viral. Where's the real action? And there were, inevitably, cruel comments. Snowflake culture. The old woman shouldn't have been there anyway. Now anyone will be able to walk into a luxury store. It's a mess. This country is lost, defending criminals now. Robert read a few comments and closed his laptop. He knew he couldn't please everyone, and honestly, he didn't want to. Some people were part of the problem, not the solution. But the important thing was that the absolute majority of comments were positive. The tide of public opinion was on the side of what was right. Meanwhile, in different parts of the city, other people were also watching the video. Marcus, the security guard from the jewelry store, was sitting on his worn sofa in his living room, his 8-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. He watched the video 3 times in a row, every word from Robert echoing in his conscience like a personal accusation. He had seen everything. He knew it was wrong, and he had done nothing. He picked up his cell phone and typed a message to the number he found on Splendor's corporate website. It was the direct contact channel for the management. "My name is Marcus Santos. I am a security guard at the Upper East Side branch. I witnessed today's incident and did nothing to stop it. I know I am also responsible. I would like to speak personally about what I saw and what I know about other similar situations that happened. If I still have a job after this, I want to be part of the change. If not, at least I want to do what's right." He sent the message and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe he would lose his job. Maybe he would face consequences. But for the first time in a long while, he could look in the mirror without looking away. Sarah, the young saleswoman, was also watching the video in her rented room in a boarding house in Queens. She had always known what happened at the jewelry store was wrong. She had witnessed other situations, though none as explicit as today's, and she had always kept quiet out of fear of losing her job, fear of being seen as problematic, fear of not being able to pay the bills. But Robert's words touched her deeply, especially when he said that some values are not negotiable. She picked up a piece of paper and began to write down everything she remembered. All the times she had seen customers being treated differently, all the veiled instructions from Lauren about watching certain profiles, all the small injustices that accumulated day after day. It would be her contribution to the promised change, even if it came at a personal cost. In Lauren's house, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights that she would now barely be able to afford without a job, the former manager also watched the video. But her reaction was different: anger, humiliation, a sense of injustice. How dare he expose her like that? How dare he turn her into a national villain? She was just doing her job, just protecting the company. But as these justifications passed through her mind, a small and insistent part of her conscience whispered uncomfortable truths. She knew. Deep down, she knew it wasn't about protecting the company. It was about power, about feeling superior, about validating prejudices she had carried since childhood without ever questioning them. She turned off the computer and went to the kitchen. She opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass, then another and another, trying to drown the shame that was beginning to crack her armor of denial. But shame, she discovered, knew how to swim. Back at Mrs. Margaret's apartment, the retired teacher prepared for bed. She put on a simple cotton nightgown, brushed her teeth, and put cream on her hands, dry from years of chalk and work. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw wrinkles that told stories. She saw eyes that had witnessed injustice and yet still held hope. She saw a woman who had survived. The phone rang. It was a former student, now a district attorney. "Mrs. Miller, I just saw the video. I didn't know it was you. I'm shocked. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Can I help in any way?" Mrs. Margaret smiled. "I'm fine, dear, truly. It was hard, I won't lie. But it was also important. Sometimes we have to go through difficult situations to expose what needs to be changed. You were always so strong, teacher. I remember the classes. You taught much more than English. You taught dignity. I tried to teach it, dear, I tried, and you know what the best part is? You learned. Look where you are today, a defender of justice. That fills me with pride." When she hung up, Mrs. Margaret lay down and looked at the ceiling. She thought of all the battles she had fought, in overcrowded classrooms, with students who arrived hungry, in meetings where her voice was ignored because she was a woman, because she was from a humble background, because she didn't have the right degrees from the right universities. She thought of her late husband who had left too soon, leaving the responsibility of raising Robert alone on her shoulders. She thought of the nights she cried in secret, not knowing if she could pay the bills, of the days she sold cakes and treats to supplement her meager teacher's salary, and she thought of Robert, her son, her pride, the boy who studied by candlelight when the power went out, who worked since he was 14 to help at home, who never gave up, never bowed, never lost his kindness despite the difficulties. A tear rolled down her face, not of sadness, of gratification, because even after everything she had been through that day, even after the public humiliation, she knew something good would come of it. Her son would ensure that. And maybe, just maybe, some other Margaret somewhere else in America wouldn't have to go through the same thing. She closed her eyes and slept, and for the first time in many nights, her dreams were peaceful. Outside, New York breathed. Millions of lives intertwining in a chaotic dance of hopes and struggles, and in the midst of all that chaos, a small seed of change had been planted. It was still too early to know if it would germinate, but at least now there was fertile soil and the will to water it. The night moved on, and with it, the promise that tomorrow could, perhaps, be a little better than today. 3 months had passed since that Thursday that changed so many lives. Spring was arriving in New York, bringing longer days and a heat that announced summer. In the Upper East Side branch of Splendor Jewelry, the changes were visible not just in the structure, but in the air one breathed. There was something different in that space that before smelled only of French perfume and privilege. Now there was humanity. Robert walked through the store aisles unannounced, as he had promised. It was his 5th surprise visit in 3 months. He discreetly observed the interactions between employees and customers. He saw Sarah assisting a woman in a simple dress with the same genuine smile she offered a customer in high heels with a designer bag. He saw the new manager, a 50-year-old man named Richard, who had come from a smaller branch in the suburbs, greeting everyone with respect, regardless of how long they stayed in the store. Marcus remained as security. Robert had decided to keep him after a 2-hour conversation where the man confessed everything. All the times he had witnessed discrimination and kept quiet. All the moments he had chosen the job over his conscience. But he also spoke about how that day had transformed him, how he could no longer sleep without thinking about Mrs. Margaret's look, how he had decided he would never again be a silent accomplice to injustice. Robert kept him not out of pity, but out of a belief in second chances for those who genuinely wanted to change. And Marcus had proven that. He had become the biggest advocate for the new policies. He actively participated in the trainings, and more importantly, he had created a personal protocol to intervene politely whenever he noticed any sign of differential treatment based on appearance. The transformation wasn't restricted to that branch. The 53 stores of the Splendor chain spread across the country went through the same restructuring. Mandatory trainings that lasted 3 full days, not quick 2-hour sessions that no one took seriously. Specialized consultants who made random visits posing as ordinary customers. A reporting channel that received, investigated and punished infractions with total transparency. In the first 2 months, 17 employees were fired for cause after proven reports of discrimination. They weren't just managers. They were salespeople, supervisors, even a regional director who thought his position protected him. Robert made it clear that hierarchy was not a shield for prejudice. If someone disrespected another human being, they were out. No exceptions. The advertising campaign launched by the company had a national impact. They weren't photos of perfect models in luxury settings. They were real images of real people. A grandmother with her granddaughter, choosing a graduation gift. An elderly couple celebrating 50 years of marriage. A young student buying her first pair of earrings with her internship salary. And in the center of it all, a photo of Mrs. Margaret, taken with her permission, with the phrase that had become the slogan of the new Splendor, "Respect isn't something you wear, it's something you carry inside." Sales, surprisingly, increased. Many customers who previously felt intimidated by the elitist atmosphere now entered with confidence. And curiously, even some wealthier customers approved of the changes. Comments like, "Finally, a company that understands that luxury should be about quality, not about exclusion," began to appear. But not everything was easy. There was resistance. Customers who complained that the jewelry store was losing its exclusivity. Employees who resigned because they didn't agree with the new policies. Investors who questioned whether all that effort would pay off financially. Robert faced every resistance with firmness. To the dissatisfied customers, he politely suggested they look for other jewelry stores that still practiced exclusion. To the resistant employees, he wished them luck in their next jobs. To the investors, he showed numbers that proved that doing the right thing was also good for business. And when numbers weren't enough, he reminded them that some values were non-negotiable. The story reached proportions no one had predicted. Mrs. Margaret was invited to give lectures at universities, companies, and education events. Initially reluctant, she accepted after Robert insisted that her voice was important. In her lectures, she didn't just talk about that day at the jewelry store. She talked about a lifetime facing prejudice, about being a woman at a time when women had fewer rights, about being a teacher in a country that undervalued education, about raising a son alone while society judged single mothers. And she spoke about dignity, about how dignity wasn't something others could take away, only something we choose to keep. Her words touched audiences of hundreds who left the lectures transformed, many with tears in their eyes, all with something to think about. At one of these lectures, held at a large university in New York, Mrs. Margaret noticed a woman sitting in the last row, blonde hair, hunched posture, trying not to be noticed. It was Lauren. After the lecture, while people crowded around to take photos and ask questions, Lauren remained in the back. When the crowd finally dispersed, she approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Miller," she began, her voice shaky, "I don't know if you remember me." Mrs. Margaret looked at her with those serene eyes that seemed to see through people. "I do remember, Lauren. How are you?" The question, asked with genuine concern, broke the defenses Lauren had built. Tears began to fall. I'm trying. I haven't gotten another job. No one wants to hire the woman from the video. My name has become synonymous with prejudice on Google. I lost friends, my family barely speaks to me. I ruined my life." Mrs. Margaret signaled for them to sit on the steps of the empty auditorium. "You ruined the life you had," she said calmly, "but that doesn't mean you can't build a new one." Lauren wiped her tears. "How? How do I come back from this? How do I convince people that I've changed?" "You don't convince them," Mrs. Margaret replied. "You show them. Real change doesn't happen with words. It happens with consistent actions over time, and mainly it happens when we do the inner work of understanding where our prejudices come from." "I've been going to therapy," Lauren confessed. 3 times a week. I'm discovering things about myself I'd rather not know, about how I was raised, about beliefs I absorbed without questioning, and about how much harm I caused without even realizing it." "That is a start," said Mrs. Margaret, "a good start. But you need to understand that some consequences don't go away. You will carry this. The question is what you do with that weight. Do you let it destroy you, or do you use it as fuel to be better?" Lauren looked at her own hands. "Can you forgive me?" Mrs. Margaret was silent for a long moment. "I already forgave you, Lauren. I forgave you that same day, because holding a grudge would only poison my heart, not punish you. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, and it doesn't mean I trust you. Trust is rebuilt with time and proof." "I understand," Lauren whispered, "and I'm sorry. Truly. I look at that day and I don't recognize the person I was. Or maybe I do recognize her, and that's even worse." "Recognition is already growth," said Mrs. Margaret, gently placing her hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Many people go their whole lives without ever admitting they were wrong. You admitted it. Now take the next step and the next and keep doing it until the person you want to be overwrites the person you were." When Lauren left, Mrs. Margaret sat on the steps, looking at the empty auditorium. Robert, who was waiting backstage, approached. "You're incredible, Mum. I would have sent her away." "I know, son. You have your father's heart, just, but hard. I have a teacher's heart. I see potential where others see lost causes." Robert sat down beside her. "Do you really believe she can change?" "I believe everyone can change, if they truly want to. I don't know if she wants to, but I gave her the tools. The rest is her responsibility." Months continued to pass. The story of Splendor Jewelry entered the case studies of business schools as an example of crisis management, transformed into an opportunity for real change. Robert was invited to speak at business congresses. He always brought the same message: Profit and ethics are not opposites, they are complementary, and companies that don't understand this are destined to fail in the era of transparency. Mrs. Margaret returned to her routine as a retired teacher, but now with occasional invitations to speak. She continued living in the same rented apartment in Brooklyn. Robert offered multiple times to buy her a better place, but she refused. "This is my home, son. I don't need a mansion. I need peace, and I have peace here." Marcus was promoted to security supervisor, responsible for training new employees. He became a reference in respectful service protocols. His story of transformation, from a silent accomplice to an agent of change, was told in trainings as an example that it's never too late to choose differently. Sarah took a manager position at another branch. She took the lessons she learned with her and built a team where respect was a basic premise, not a differentiator. She kept in touch with Mrs. Margaret, visiting her when she could, and always thanking her for having been a witness to a lesson that changed her life. And Lauren. Lauren continued her solitary journey of reconstruction. She got a temporary job in a small costume jewelry shop where she worked without glamour, without power, just trying to survive and learn. She continued in therapy. She continued facing the consequences of her choices, but also, slowly, she continued changing. A year after that incident, Splendor Jewelry organized an event, not a store opening or a collection launch, an event celebrating organizational culture. Employees from all branches were invited, and in the center of the stage, a tribute. Robert went up on stage and asked his mother to join him. Mrs. Margaret, embarrassed by the attention, climbed the steps slowly. Robert held her hand. "A year ago," he began, "my mother walked into one of our stores and was treated like a criminal. It was one of the worst days of my life watching that, but it was also, in a way, one of the most important, because it exposed a truth we needed to face, and it gave us the opportunity to do things differently." He looked at the crowd of employees. "Today, I no longer see a company that discriminates. I see a company that respects. A company where every person who walks in is treated with the dignity they deserve. And that didn't happen because I ordered it. It happened because each of you chose to do things differently. You chose to question prejudices. You chose to treat people as people." Mrs. Margaret took the microphone. Her voice, though soft, filled the auditorium. "I didn't want to be a symbol of anything. I just wanted to buy a gift. But life puts us in situations we don't choose to teach lessons we need to learn. That day taught me that the fight against prejudice isn't over. It continues every day and every interaction. But it also taught me that change is possible, when there is will, when there is courage, and when there is love." She looked at Robert. "My son transformed pain into purpose. You transformed a toxic culture into a culture of respect, and together we proved that a company can be profitable and ethical, successful and human, powerful and kind." The ovation was deafening. Tears ran down the faces of people who understood the weight of those words. Because many there had also been victims of prejudice at some point. They had also been judged by appearance. They had also carried the pain of not being seen as full human beings. That night, Robert and Mrs. Margaret had dinner together at a simple restaurant near her apartment. Nothing fancy, just good food and better conversation. "Are you happy, Mom?" Robert asked. "I am. At peace, son. Which is better than happiness. Happiness comes and goes, peace stays. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't bought that company, if you hadn't agreed to do that test." Mrs. Margaret smiled. "Life doesn't work with what if. It works with what is. And what is now is that something changed, not just in your company, but in the people who saw this story, in the conversations it generated, in the reflections it provoked." "Do you think the country will change?" Robert asked. "Truly." Mrs. Margaret looked out the restaurant window, seeing New York pulse outside. "The country changes every day, son. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but stories like ours plant seeds, and seeds germinate. Maybe we won't see the full forest, but someone will, and that is already worth it." Months turned into years. The story of Splendor Jewelry eventually left the trending topics. Other news took its place, other scandals, other outrages. But the impact remained. in corporate laws that began to require anti-discrimination policies, in trainings that became mandatory in retail sectors, in people who, upon entering a store, remembered that story and treated employees with respect, and in employees who, upon seeing simple-looking customers, remembered that story and offered the same service they would give to anyone. Mrs. Margaret continued living her simple life, giving volunteer literacy classes, visiting former students, caring for her small garden on the balcony, and occasionally, when invited, sharing her story so that others would learn what she took a lifetime to understand, that respect isn't a favor, it's a right, and dignity is not negotiable. Robert continued running the company with the same philosophy. It grew. He opened new branches. He expanded to other countries. But he never abandoned the principles he had established on that difficult day when he saw his mother being humiliated. And always, in every important decision, he asked himself, what would my mother do? What would be more human? And Splendor Jewelry became more than a luxury company. It became an example. Imperfect because nothing human is perfect, but real. That change is possible. That profit and ethics can coexist. That treating people with dignity is not a weakness, it is a strength. The true jewel, everyone eventually understood, was never in the display cases. It was in mutual respect, in shared humanity, in the daily choice to see the other as an equal, regardless of clothes, accent, age, or bank account. And that jewel, unlike gold and diamonds, only increased in value the more it was shared. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Margaret and Robert has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of dignity, transformation, and respect, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it Mrs. Margaret's courage in the face of humiliation, Robert's determination to do what's right, or perhaps the possibility of redemption that we all carry? Every day we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, which make us reflect on who we are and who we want to be. Because in the end, we are all part of the same humanity, all deserving of the same respect. We wait for you in the next episode with another story that will make you feel, think, and perhaps change a little bit the way you see the world.